Good afternoon. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. Our guest today is Paul Armentano. Paul is the Deputy Director of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and also serves as a faculty member at Oaksterdam University. He's a regular contributor to thehill.com, the San Francisco Chronicle, as well as numerous other print and online publications. Paul is the co-author of the book Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? His most recent book, The Citizen's Guide to State-by-State Marijuana Laws, is available from Whitman Publishing. Paul, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Is Jeff Sessions repealing the Cole Memo with the support, implicit or explicit, of Trump? Trump seems to have been conspicuously absent this week from the public debate.
Well, of course, Jeff Sessions was appointed by Donald Trump. It was very clear, based on Sessions' history as a member of Congress, where he stood on this issue. So this action by the Sessions-led Justice Department to reverse these Obama-era directives should not come as a surprise to anyone, including members of the Senate that confirmed his nomination, and it should not come as a surprise to Donald Trump, who appointed Jeff Sessions for this position.
What will be...
We're talking about a man who, when he was in the Senate, co-sponsored legislation to impose the death penalty to certain violators of marijuana laws. That's Jeff Sessions in a nutshell. So again, this latest action comes as no surprise to any of us who are familiar with his history.
That takes the meaning of the word draconian to a whole new level. What will be the political fallout of the Trump administration reneging on this campaign promise? On the campaign trail, Trump pledged several times to take a more states' rights view of this issue and leave marijuana laws to the states.
Well, my expectation is that the administration is already facing significant blowback. They're certainly facing a political blowback from a number of members of Congress, and they are also facing, not surprisingly, a public blowback. This reversal by the administration is not only bad policy, it's bad politics. And I say that because according to the latest polling, over 6 in 10 Americans believe that the adult use of marijuana ought to be legal. Over 9 in 10 Americans believe that the medical use of marijuana ought to be legal, and about 75% of voters, regardless of whether they support or oppose the legalization of marijuana, believe that this is an issue that is best decided by the states and not the federal government. Trump is not only going against the majority of what the public thinks, he's also isolating his own base.
Senator Cory Gardner has emerged as a leading critic of the Justice Department on this issue. He's even said he's going to place holds on judicial nominations till this is resolved, even though he himself opposed Colorado's legalization effort. Are we seeing a backlash from a more libertarian wing of the GOP that wants to allow states to make their own decisions on marijuana?
Well, we're certainly seeing a lot of statements to that effect. We have yet to see any strong action being taken by the Congress, and particularly by Republican members of Congress. Again, Republican and libertarian-leaning Republicans in the Senate had an opportunity to address Jeff Sessions months ago when they voted unanimously to confirm him to be Attorney General, fully well knowing that Sessions had a long history of these sort of actions and held a number of very non-libertarian positions when it came to criminal justice. For example, Sessions' love of using civil asset forfeiture so that the government could seize the property of individuals who have not even been convicted of a crime. That is in Jeff Sessions' record. Yet we had senators like Rand Paul and Cory Gardner go ahead and confirm him anyway. now they're reaping what they sowed.
Didn't I see, though, in Cory Gardner's statement this week that Sessions had actually said that he thought that the Cole Memorandum was appropriate with regard to federalism and state marijuana law? Is that true?
So during his Senate confirmation hearings, he was asked by Senator Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont, what his thoughts were with regard to this Obama-era memorandum. And at that time, Sessions was somewhat ambivalent. He did say that he found the principles behind the memo to be appropriate, but then he also said he didn't believe that the memo was being enforced in the manner that it ought to be. So his answer was quite equivocal, and again, knowing his history on this issue, knowing the public statements that he had made just prior to the confirmation process, and certainly looking at the statements and actions he's engaged in after the confirmation process, again, you would have to have been sleeping under a rock to not know this was coming. This is who Jeff Sessions is, and it is who he always has been.
And speaking of Rand Paul, his father, Ron Paul, this week wrote in an op-ed that Trump should fire Sessions post-haste. Speaking of congressional action, House Resolution 1227, also known as the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act, seeks to remove marijuana as a Schedule I drug and decriminalize it at the federal level. What is your prognosis for H.R. 1227? Does it have a realistic shot of being given a vote and passing both houses of Congress? And is there any chance that Trump would sign such a bill?
Well, there are a number of bills that are pending in Congress, both in the House and in the U.S. Senate, that would address this issue once and for all, that would, in fact, comport federal law in a manner that is consistent with the rapidly changing cultural status of marijuana and also the rapidly changing legal status of marijuana on the state level. It is entirely possible that the blowback from this move by the Justice Department may give new life to the prospect that these sort of efforts will gain some traction in Congress. But realistically, when we look at the current environment in Congress, when we look at the individuals who are chairing the key committees that these sort of bills would need to go through, people like Senator Charles Grassley from Iowa or Peter Sessions from Texas, we know full well, based on their history, based on their past statements, that these individuals are not going to allow any debate on these sort of initiatives. So it wasn't long ago that Representative Sessions would not even allow a floor amendment debate on reauthorizing federal protections that limit the federal government from just this sort of interference in state marijuana programs. This is an amendment that has been in place since 2014. It has bipartisan support. We know it had majority support in the House. So the only way to defeat it was to have Sessions not permit it to be voted on, which is what he did. So again, in that sort of environment, where literally a handful of Republicans in leadership positions can bottle up any sort of reform, it is difficult to imagine a way to break through that bottleneck without a change in the makeup of the House and Senate.
It's a serious problem. Now, although with regard to congressional action, they seem much more favorable to a hands-off policy with medicinal marijuana via the, I believe it's called the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment, or what was, explain to us briefly what Rohrabacher-Blumenauer says.
Sure. So that's the amendment I was just referring to. So since 2014, Congress has imposed an amendment in its budgetary bills that limits the Justice Department from spending federal funds for the purpose of interfering with state medical marijuana programs. That is the amendment that is known as the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment. As I said earlier, it has bipartisan support in Congress. It has majority support among the members of Congress. But because it is a budgetary amendment, it has to be reauthorized every time Congress passes a new budget. Presently, those protections are set to expire on Friday, January 19th, unless they are reauthorized. They will not have the opportunity in the House of Representatives to decide whether or not to reauthorize that provision because one man, Representative Peter Sessions from Texas, had declared that the House will not be permitted to vote on that particular issue. Conversely, we do have those protections authorized in the U.S. Senate, where they were carried by Representative Leahy from Vermont. So, given the fact that we have a House version that does not contain these provisions and a Senate version that does, the outcome is going to decide on what actions leadership takes when these two bills are reconciled. And I would argue it's essentially a coin flip with regard to whether those actions will be reauthorized or not. But again, that decision will not be made by a vote on the House floor. It's a decision that is going to be made under the cloak of darkness by a handful of congressmen in conference committee.
That is unfortunate. Paint us a picture of the financial cost of continuing to prosecute and incarcerate marijuana offenders, and give us an overview of the tax outlook here, the tax revenue that could be generated by nationwide legalization.
Well, we know already, looking at the jurisdictions that have regulated the adult use and retail sale of cannabis, that the revenues brought in by regulating this behavior are far greater than the numbers that were initially estimated. For instance, in the state of Colorado, which has engaged in retail marijuana sales since the beginning of 2014, that state has brought in over $500 million in new tax revenue from the sale of marijuana to adults. In Nevada, which recently began engaging in retail sales of cannabis late this summer, they're now bringing in over $5 million in tax revenue every month. In the state of Washington, we're seeing on a monthly basis over $130 million worth of transactions taking place with regard to the sale of marijuana to adults. So we know that we can regulate cannabis. We know it's going to bring in significant amounts of tax revenue, and conversely, it's going to allow law enforcement and the courts to spend less money and, in fact, reprioritize their spending to focus on more serious crimes.
How do you envision the future of the state-by-state battle for legal recreational marijuana? Will it remain largely a Western and Northeastern phenomenon, or is there hope in places like the Midwest and the South as well?
Well, at the moment, certainly looking at the short term, this does seem to be, in many cases, as you said, a coastal phenomenon. Just today, about an hour before we are speaking, the governor of Vermont made it public that he intends to sign legislation that legalizes the adult use and cultivation of marijuana in that state. A bill is sitting on his desk right now that would enact those sort of changes.
And that's a Republican governor, Phil, I'm drawing a blank on the last name.
It's Republican Governor Phil Scott.
That's it, Phil
Who has
Scott.
a fairly interesting history with this issue. He was sent by lawmakers a very similar bill last year that he vetoed But this year, he indicates he's had a change of heart on this issue and that he intends to sign this legalization bill that's been put before him. Vermont will become the 9th state to legalize these activities, but it will be the first state to do so legislatively.
As opposed to a referendum.
Yes, in all of the prior cases, these law changes were enacted by a direct vote of the people. We know that in New Jersey, the governor-elect has said he intends to sign legalization within the first 100 days of his term. In New Hampshire, the House of Representatives just voted and approved a legalization measure. So we certainly do expect, over the coming months, to see a number of states add to this growing total of jurisdictions where the adult use of marijuana is legal. But whether we're going to see these sort of legal changes in the short term sort of spill over into more states in the Midwest or in the Southeast, outside of a initiative in some of those states, politically, I don't think we're at a point where the environment is appropriate that we could realistically get bills like that through both chambers and signed by a governor. That doesn't mean there's not public support in those regions of the country for these sort of changes, but I don't believe the political support is yet there.
Speaking of a Republican governor in Vermont being the first to sign a recreational marijuana bill into law, what would you say are the best arguments to make to a Republican versus a Democrat with regard to the end of federal marijuana prohibition or ending its classification as a Schedule I drug in the same category as something like heroin?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that when we look at public perception of this issue, it is strongly bipartisan. We see a nearly equal support for marijuana law reform among self-identified Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So unfortunately, it's really largely at the political level where this issue seems to be far more bipartisan. That said, one would think that this is an issue that's tailor-made for many Republicans, because Republicans typically rail against the failures of big government, taxpayer-funded programs that fail to yield any tangible results.
And especially big federal government programs.
Exactly. And it is hard to think of a more entrenched, long-standing federal program that has literally cost taxpayers billions of dollars, wasted billions of dollars in resources, and has not yielded any positive, tangible results. The reality is there is a far greater portion of the American public who not only uses cannabis, but has ready access to cannabis today than did nearly 100 years ago when the federal government decided to go down the road of prohibition. It is sometimes said that the changes in marijuana policy that we've seen in recent years at the state level is an experiment. But the reality is that in this country, it's the criminalization of cannabis that has been the failed experiment. We have 100 years of failure, and that's why the majority of the American public has acknowledged that they want to go in a different direction.
Taking a bit of a different tact here, what do you say to the arguments, A, that legal marijuana will lead to an increase in driving under the influence, and B, that the marijuana industry will now target heavy marijuana users with aggressive advertising like the tobacco or alcohol industries do, and direct this advertising towards consumers that may already have a drug problem?
So those are two, very interesting questions. Regarding the first, with regard to traffic safety, or really any question with regard to the public safety implications of legalization, fortunately, we have ample amounts of data with which we can determine evidence-based responses to these sort of questions. If one looks, for instance, on PubMed, which is the repository for all peer-reviewed scientific studies published anywhere in the world with regard to cannabis, we'll find over 25,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies specific to marijuana and its impact on the individual and its impact on society. That's more than the totality of science we have available for ibuprofen, or acetaminophen, or Vicodin, or Adderall. Frankly, it's more than the total body of evidence we have for those drugs combined. So the fact is, we know a whole lot about marijuana, and we also know a whole lot about how these changes in the legal status of marijuana at the state level have impacted health and safety outcomes. So with regard to traffic safety, we have a number of peer-reviewed studies that have assessed the impact of these legal changes on traffic safety. With regard to the enactment of medical cannabis at the state level, we find that the imposition of that change is associated with an overall decrease in traffic fatalities, particularly among those aged 25 to 44 years of age. With regard to the legalization of the adult use of marijuana, there was a study published last year in the American Journal of Public Health that looked at car accident trends in the 3 years prior and in the 3 years after the regulation of adult use marijuana in Colorado and Washington. It also compared the trends in those states with traffic fatality trends in 7 control states, states outside of Colorado and Washington that did not enact any change in their marijuana policies. And what the authors of that study found, which to date is the definitive study to answer this question, is that there was no change in traffic, the number of traffic fatalities or the number of non-fatal traffic accidents in Colorado and Washington post-legalization compared to states that hadn't changed their marijuana laws. To date, we see no tangible adverse effect on traffic safety from a state legalizing the adult use of marijuana.
Interesting. NORML confines its advocacy to marijuana issues, but presumably the same principles would apply to all currently illicit substances concerned in the war on drugs. Do you see a future like we see in places like the Netherlands or Portugal, where we can decriminalize, tax, and regulate drugs and treat drug abuse as a public health rather than a criminal matter?
Certainly, there are overlying principles that ought to govern these public policy decisions that I think are entirely relevant. At the end of the day, I think most Americans agree that we should treat all controlled substances, not just marijuana, as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. And that's really the key difference between U.S. drug policy and the long-standing drug policies of a number of other nations, like the ones you just named. Unfortunately, we're just not there yet in this country, certainly not politically, and I think even with regard to public opinion, while we see that the public has changed its position with regard to marijuana, we have not seen that the public in significant numbers is yet to change its opinion with regard to how to address or deal with other illicit substances, other than this broader approach where most Americans, at the end of the day, say that users of illicit substances, including substances other than marijuana, ought not to face incarceration, but they ought to face some sort of treatment in order to get them help.
Something that libertarians such as myself deeply believe in is the principle of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle. the idea that human beings are responsible for making their own choices to the extent that they don't infringe on others' constitutional or human rights. Why does it seem that there are still so many politicians on the left and the right who don't believe in this principle of self-ownership and personal responsibility?
Well, what's really interesting is that from a politically ideological standpoint, I think both sides are coming at this in a very different way, but they're both reaching the same conclusion. You're correct that many on the political left would not necessarily favor the sort of non-aggression principle in the manner you've described. They would argue that there's sort of a spillover and ripple effect where individuals' behavior end up impacting society as a whole, and therefore the federal government has a legitimate interest in stepping in.
It's almost like an in loco parentis argument. The government is taking the place of parents.
And Republicans tend to reject that argument, but there's a huge marijuana and drug policy exception to that argument on the part of most Republican elected officials. And when they're confronted with this sort of hypocrisy, if you will, one of the answers that I tend to hear from many conservative-leading Republicans and other elected politicians is that the use of drugs, including marijuana, by default is anti-freedom because individuals become slaves to their drug use, and therefore Republicans and the government as a whole has a right to intervene in a manner that they would personally define as not violating those principles. I think most of the public would disagree.
Well, hopefully we can get more Rand Pauls and Cory Gardners and fewer Jeff Sessions and Mike Pences in the GOP. We've been speaking today with Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Paul, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me, and certainly I would encourage your listeners who want to learn more about this issue and perhaps even get involved in advocating in favor of these sort of legislative changes to check out the NORML website. They can do that by going to www.norml.org. Great.
Thank you so much, and perhaps at some point in the future, if there's interesting development in this area, you'd be so kind as to come back.
I'd be happy to do so.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, Paul. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.